for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Rachel Kim, and I'm the marketing manager here at MadCap Software. Today, I'm excited to introduce Chad Kreiger, who is a publication specialist at Vernier Software and Technology. Chad is an experienced Flare user, a long-time MadWorld attendee, and recently spoke at MadWorld 2018 here in San Diego. Today's webinar is adapted from one of his presentations, which had a lot of great feedback from the MadWorld audience, and it's all about how he and his team adapted more than a decade's worth of Word documents into Flare. So if you're looking for tips on how to prepare a smooth Flare implementation, you're at the right place. We got a lot to cover today, but I wanted to touch on a few housekeeping items before we begin. This webinar will be recorded and emailed to all registrants, so if you have to leave early, we'll be sending a follow-up email with a link to the recording. And if you have any questions during the webinar, feel free to use the questions panel in GoToWebinar. If we have time at the end, we'll do our best to answer those questions, and whatever we don't get to, we'll also follow up with a full question and answers document in that follow-up email. So with that, I'll turn it over to Chad.
Great, thank you, Rachel. And good morning, everyone. My name again is Chad Kreiger, and I'm a publication specialist at Vernier Software and Technology. I've been a Flare user since 2012, or as I like to kid, I've been using Flare since I was 12, at least it feels that way, going back to version 8. And I have some contact information on here as well. If you'd like to drop me a line after the presentation, I would love to hear about how your Flare journey is going. And if you would like to follow up on any of the points that we cover here today, I'd be more than happy to do that on a private line as well. Rome wasn't built in a day, and neither was our Flare project. Today I'm going to share with you how the publications department at Vernier has embarked on a journey to wrangle tens of thousands of archaic Word files into Flare for content management. I'll share with you key milestones we've reached and cost-saving decisions that we've made along the way. But first, how did this journey begin, and why did we choose Flare? Well, the answer to that question lies somewhere between the keystrokes of Control F and Find Next. And I'll share that story with you a little bit more after I tell you a little bit about us. Founded in 1981, Vernier is a science education company, and we're located in Beaverton, Oregon. And we make and sell data collection sensors and software for science classrooms across the country and, quite frankly, across the world. And they span all sciences. So we cover classrooms such as biology, chemistry, and physics, just to name a few. And we span all ages, so the elementary level, middle school level, and even the high school and collegiate level. So some of our products are temperature sensors, pH sensors, sensors that measure sound and force. And then you can connect these sensors to conduct experiments and graph data on our software and apps. And with more than 400 products, you could say that we have our work cut out for us in supporting all of the user manuals and troubleshooting guides that such product lines would need. But we also support our customers, who are mostly teachers, by writing experiments and selling lab books. Now, I'll get into the anatomy of these lab books a little bit later, but it's easy to see how our 4-person publications team has a lot of content to manage, and over the years, our library of content has amassed tens of thousands of files. So when searching for a content management tool, our goal was to utilize cutting-edge content management system technology to modernize our outputs, but we also wanted to streamline our processes on the back end in a way that was seamless to the customer on the front end. Our customers were used to how our lab books look and feel, and we wouldn't want to strain that commitment to them in the adoption of a new tool. And yet we wanted to find a way to modernize our outputs for them and bring them new content and new deliveries. And we also wanted to better improve how we were maintaining our content on the back end so that we could focus more of our energy and our efforts on the words that we write and less on managing how how those words are stored, maintained, archived, and delivered to the customer. As we said on our journey, so we needed to examine some cultural changes that needed to take place internally. We needed to identify all of our assets and even our image files. And we also wanted to assess our systems to ensure they were compatible with Flare before we even downloaded the software. And finally, we wanted to lay the framework for our ultimate Flare project. So before our journey could even begin, we set out to realize, we realized right away that we needed a content management system. And as I alluded before, our tipping point occurred one day while making a specification change to one of our products, our colorimeter. You see, there was a specification change that occurred to the warm-up time. It used to be one number, and an upgrade to the product made the warm-up time a new number. And so we set about to update all of our content to reflect this change. And so we very quickly realized that more than 200 files were going to be affected by this change. User manuals, content that was posted to the web, experiment files, workshop handouts, all of this content needed to be updated for what seems like a very small change. And so using the sophisticated tools we had at our time, we opened up each Word file one by one, and we put in the all familiar keystroke, Control F, to open up the Find window, and we placed the former value and the new value, and we clicked Replace and Find Next until all instances were replaced in each file. And we would close the file, we'd open up a new file, find all of the instances of the old value, replace it with the new value, over and over again until it was updated in all instances of our project. But that wasn't enough. We were still acting like a manual content management system at that time. So we manually converted all of those Word files to the appropriate file types, usually like a PDF format. And then we manually archived those files in our source code. So in Perforce at the time was our source control system for maintaining our pristine files. And then we manually had to make sure that all of our resources had this updated information. So we wanted our website to have updated copy. We needed to notify our vendors who print all of our lab books that there's been this change that they would need to print new lab books going forward. Same thing with our user manuals that ship with the products. We needed to make sure that our shipping department could order new user manuals that had this updated value. And you can see how we were doing a lot of this ourselves, and we realized at that moment, maybe we need to start looking into adopting a content management system to do some of this legwork for us. And so in going about in adopting this content management system, before we had even settled on Flare, we went to the senior management partners and senior level managers for buy-in in adopting a content management system. And this wasn't necessarily a slam dunk in their eyes because we're a company that's very mature. We've been around nearly 40 years, maybe 30 years or so at the time. And I think that they saw that we had several decades worth of content already that we were maintaining very well. We had over 10,000 files, maybe 20,000 files in our system at that time. Lab books, experiment files, user manuals. And I think what ultimately sold them on our journey of looking for a content management system was when we shared with them the efficiencies that a tool such as Flare could provide to us, how we could modernize our outputs, but ultimately, as a publications team, focus more on the editorial reviews and writing the content ourselves and less effort in maintaining that content and delivering that to all the different channels and setting it up in all the different target outputs that it needed to be produced in. And so our management team gave us the green light to go out and look for a single sourcing system. And so some of the criteria that we were looking for was something that could streamline our content. Again, looking at that colorimeter example, we wanted to be able to make changes in one source file that we could then output to all the different target types that we needed to be able to produce for our customers. That went hand in hand with this concept of multi-target and multi-channel publishing, which was very attractive to us. We wanted to also find a tool that was CSS and HTML based, something that could stand the test of time, something that wasn't like a document processor specific tool like we were already using Word. We wanted it to be something that was a little bit more modern and something that would be convertible so that we could quickly turn our documents into websites, mobile outputs, and other types of printed output files like Word and PDF files. And in looking at all of the different features that content management systems offered, we also wanted to make sure that whatever tool we adopted supported the dynamic types of content that we have here at Vernier. Our user manuals, which are typically folded booklets, they're various sizes. Oftentimes they're landscape outputs that are folded in half. Sometimes we print 2 per page. We have a lot of very specific printer settings that we wanted to make sure that page layouts would be able to support. But we also wanted to maintain our same content for lab books in the same system. And our lab books, which look a lot like a textbook, are your much more standard 8.5 by 11 portrait style printouts with front and back printing and all sorts of different front matter, back matter. And we had a very high expectation of being able to maintain all of that content in one system with all the different versatile outputs that were going to be necessary. And as we started to hone in on Flare, one feature that really stood out to us was this concept of conditionalized text. And if I could look at one product in particular, take for example our GoDirect temperature probe. Now this probe, you're able to collect temperature data when you use it, so you can collect data about how hot or cold maybe a liquid is or air temperature and how that may change over time, and you can graph that data. And you can graph that data on a computer or a mobile device, and you can connect to that mobile device or that computer through either a USB connection or a Bluetooth connection. It's a lot of the same steps, but there are different steps based on what type of software or application you're using to gather and reflect the data. And so we wanted to be able to write our content for our user steps in one location, but then have conditionalized text that says if you're using a USB cable, step 2 might look a little bit different versus if you're using Bluetooth wireless technology. Or your button clicks are going to be a little bit different if you're doing this on a computer versus the taps and swipes that you might be doing on a mobile device. And so we found Flare very attractive with this concept of conditionalized text, where you could maintain your sets of instructions in one place, but then channel those differences using conditions and different targets. So as we started to move toward Flare as our ultimate tool here, we realized that we were going to need to revisit the page design and styles that we've been using in Word, because that was going to be our ultimate import, was importing and migrating our content from Word to Flare. So we needed to make sure that our Word files were set up in a way that was going to manage that migration as smoothly as possible. Now, using styles in Word wasn't a new thing to our organization. Again, we had been maintaining our content for quite a few years. Over a couple of decades worth of Word files have been accumulated, and those were in fairly pristine shape. But anybody who's used, let's say, Microsoft product over the years, you know that what Word looked like in 1995, 1998, changed through the years, through 2000, through 2003, etc. And so we just needed to make sure that all of our content had very similar based styles to map over to the styles that were going to be corresponding on the Flare side. And that was for all of our user manuals and our experiment files for the lab books that we wanted to import into Flare. So there was definitely a cultural shift where that was much more important now that we were going to be adopting a new system. Topic-based authoring with one voice was also a cultural change that was concurrent with this one voice initiative that was going on through our marketing department and through our organization at the same time. Let me focus on writing as a topic first here. Topic-based authoring was this new concept within our department where we wanted to set the parameters of what a topic was going to look like for us in Flare, specifically with our user manuals. And so we defined a topic as answering a very specific question to a very specific issue or problem, and it being this very targeted chunk of information that once that was answered in a satisfying way, that was where that topic ended, and then we branched out into a new topic. And how that worked with our user manuals was on a section-by-section basis. So our care and maintenance section might be one topic where we talk about how to care and maintain your sensor. Or there might be a safety section, and that was answering one specific question about safety issues and whether or not you should wear goggles when using this product, or whether or not you should have eye protection or be wearing gloves, etc. And this allowed us to organize our content and develop templates for our user manuals as we got started in implementing Flare. And this idea of writing with one voice kind of went concurrently with the topic-based authoring model, where you can use snippets and variables in order to say exactly the same thing in all instances and changing your content in one place, but then targeting it out to all the other topics and all of your other targets that are affected by any changes that take place. And this was important to us because in our one voice initiative with our customer, we are dedicated to being accurate and consistent in our voice and in our tone. And so adopting topic-based authoring and also being able to use snippets and variables was very, very helpful in our transition to this model of writing. And a new model in writing for us as well was to be able to publish in an agile environment. And so what this looked like for us, specifically in the user manual processes, was getting involved in the process earlier with any product change or any new product release, so that we were working with the engineers and the developers and the product owners much earlier in the process, providing them with templates, giving them anticipated content that we would need to be able to fill the blanks in for, and then working with them through the entire product life cycle, so that as soon as the product is ready to be released and shipped to the customer, that piece of paper, that user manual that needs to be provided at the very end, is also moving along at the same pace, so that there's no lag time between the ship date and the product documentation being ready. This was as opposed to what some organizations might find as a more traditional waterfall approach, where the product gets made, the documentation team is notified at the very end, you're kind of scrambling at the very end, the product is ready, everybody's ready to ship, but for some reason the user manual's not ready because they were involved much later in the process, and everybody's waiting on a piece of paper. We really liked this model of agile writing. Another thing that Flare was able to do as we were looking at agile writing was it gave us some new publishing mediums that we didn't have access to before. And what I mean by that is publishing directly to the web and publishing directly from mobile devices. And so as a product was ready, what we found was we could create dynamic websites that presented our content in a much friendlier version on the web, and also would represent very well as a website using an HTML5 target on mobile devices. And this was new for us and allowed us to publish changes much more quickly, where the customer doesn't have to wait to receive a piece of paper in the mail to see their user manual. We had dynamic web content waiting for them when they got their product, and they could immediately see any changes to that as well, because we could publish in a much more agile environment that way too. This also went along with our lab books, which I'll get to a little bit further along here. But we used to ship CDs with our lab books that had content for a lot of different software combination support that we wanted the teachers to be able to use in their classroom. And I haven't seen a computer with a CD-ROM in some time. What we were able to do was convert our content to what we like to call electronic resources, where now we have web-based downloads for our customer, so they're also able to access content more readily, and as content changes, they're able to keep up with those changes in a more agile-based environment. So let's shift our attention toward these lab books a little bit more. And as we began to adopt Flare in our organization, we needed to do an inventory of what all of our assets were. I'll give you a little bit of background on our lab books. The physical copies of them look and feel much like a textbook, and they have very specific science-based instructions for experiments that you can conduct using our sensors and our software and applications. These lab books typically are about 200 to 300 pages in length, and they have a lot of content that you might expect to see. They have intro pages and front matter. There's a table of contents. There's equipment chart, appendices, and then we also include teacher instruction pages along with the experiments. And the teacher instruction pages allow the teachers to see sample data, expected results, and any tips or special hints that they might want to provide their classroom with as they're setting up the experiments for their classes. And so we needed to look at the documents of each of these lab books. Now we have close to 40 lab book titles, so you can see where a lab book that's 200 to 300 pages, and then we've got 40 titles. We had a lot of content to go over, and we also had the electronic resources to review, and I'll share those with you in a little bit, in a couple of slides here. But these 200 to 300 page lab books were actually probably more like 2,000 pages a piece when you consider the electronic resources that we provide with them as well. We needed to look at the similarities that we had in our content, and we also wanted to look at how we managed things such as barcodes for our user manuals, but also the graphics, the logos, the illustrations, the sample data. We needed to figure out how to maintain all of that in Flare as well. And so let's take a look at a content map here of our lab books. This was made using a software called MindNode Pro. And what each of these swirls represents, and I know that most of the content here is fairly illegible, but each of these swirls represent different science areas where we had lab book titles. So some of our chemistry books, our engineering books, our physics books, as well as some of the content that was included based on sensors that were used and referenced within each of the experiments for these books. And then some of the additional content, we have one swirl based off of our image library as well. And then if we can look at one lab book in particular, I'll share with you our chemistry with Vernier lab book. And this was the mapping project we did for that book in particular, where you can see in the upper left where We have some of the sensors referenced, the gas pressure sensor, the pH sensor, and some of the experiments associated with those. So we could kind of get an idea of where some of our crossover content was, where our unique content was, and how we wanted to organize that in Flare. And I blew up a little bit further that green swirl there where we talk about our outputs. And specifically, these were all the different output types that we expected to be able to provide to our customers. We were already creating PDF and Word document files, but we also wanted to be able to create HTML-based outputs and a few other future-proof concepts as well. And ultimately, what a completed chemistry lab book prior to Flare looked like for us follows this file structure modeled here, where we have the top level folder. Now this is more looking at our electronic resources. So remember, we have the physical textbook file that you can order that has one set of experiment instructions and some teacher help. But then we also provide these electronic resources. And what those do is it shows how to use our sensors with other combinations of software and applications that we provide. So we have LabQuest instructions and Logger Pro instructions, and those are different software titles and applications that you could also use to complete the experiments with our sensors. Every classroom is set up a little bit differently, and so we want our content to be as versatile to the teacher's environment as possible. So not everybody is using computers. Some people have Chromebooks, some teachers have iPads, and so we want to make sure that we have a solution for our customers no matter what combination they have in their classroom. We want to make sure that we have additional resources and experiments. So these files, as I mentioned before, can sometimes exceed 2,000 or 3,000 pages worth of content for each lab book. And when you're looking at potentially 40 lab books in our library and all of our user manuals, again, you can see why single sourcing our content and writing with one source base and being able to output all these different combinations, letting the content management do the heavy lifting was very, very important for us. So let's look at the nuts and bolts of downloading Flare on our computer and how that even started out for us. Well, right out of the gate, we had quite a showstopper, what felt like a showstopper, but really it wasn't that big of a deal. We use MacBook Pros extensively throughout our organization and within our publications department. And so right out of the gate, we needed to explore Mac OS virtual machine options in order to download Windows onto our computers. So I think there's a bit of a misconception that Flare doesn't work on a Mac environment. And while that's true, you can't download Flare specifically to a Mac OS, there are options available for creating a virtual environment in order to access Windows. And so we use what's called VMware. I know that there's a few other options out there as well. And I believe that Nita Beck has actually written a blog post on this as well that you may be able to find somewhere on the MadCap website, or if you did a Google search for it. But there are options out there for us, and I can say that the VMware environment on the Mac machine has worked flawlessly for us so far. We haven't really run into any issues with the virtual environment creating any sort of slow issues or anything of that nature. So that's been a good solution for us so far. So I would encourage you, if you're running a Mac and you're curious about Flare, there are some options out there for you. We also needed to figure out where we wanted our project location to be and what source control we wanted to use. So we decided fairly quickly that downloading Flare to each individual team member's local machine and having the project located with the same naming convention in the same file location, but on an individual, on a local basis. So we have the Flare project saved fairly high up within each of our C drives with the same naming location, and then we're using source control to share our files and to archive and maintain our workflow. And I've heard some people try to use Flare like on a shared network drive, and I've heard that that's created all sorts of different issues, or it just creates different obstacles that you need to solve for. I've heard that bandwidth can be a real issue if you're trying to use Flare off of a shared network drive. So I think we found saving it to our local machines at the highest level up file structure was the best solution for us, especially since we were using source control to do all that file sharing for us anyway. Speaking of source control, that can always be a bit of a journey for new Flare users as well. And we felt that same way also. We actually started off with Perforce as our source control, and that's because that was the legacy source control we were using before our Flare environment. So source control wasn't new to our organization, and being able to maintain and archive our files with source control was something that we wanted to maintain using in Flare, so that all users could check out files, make changes to their files, save their files, and then push them up to a repository where other users on the team could then also pull down those files and be able to access them. So if, say, one of my team members, Jamie, is working on a file, she can make a change, and then later on I can pull down that change and access that later on. When we first started using Perforce with Flare, it was a little bit tricky getting that connection started. There were some configuration issues, some compatibility issues, and as we upgraded to future iterations of Flare, we realized we weren't going to be able to continue using Perforce, and we made what felt like us a very big leap to using Git instead. And Git was a little bit of a shift in a mindset for us, because when you use Perforce, it was much more of a traditional, you own a file as a user and you check that file out and you make your change and then you save that change and then you give everybody else on your team access to that one file that you've checked out. When you're using Git for source control, what you're doing is everybody has their own version of the project at the time, and then you push up that entire project each time. So you don't necessarily know who is accessing which files at which time, and sometimes that can create a merge conflict. And so what we were able to do was set up better swim lanes within our own team and set up better parameters about who was going to access which types of files at which time. We got a little bit more adamant about process documentation and making sure everybody was following the same steps so that files weren't getting lost. But what we ended up doing was we found that we had a better sense of stability and we were experiencing less exception errors if we actually used what's called Git tortoise outside of Flare. So we were actually using source control, and to this day we're actually using source control outside of Flare to maintain all of our Flare structures. And that may not be the best description of how to use Git, but that's how that's working in our environment. I know that there's other opportunities to explore with branching and other methods of workflow, especially when you're using global project linking and other types of project setups. What I found talking to a lot of different Flare users at MadWorld is that everybody's using a lot of the same source control softwares, but everybody's project looks a little bit different. So we've also experienced that on our end. And that's why finding options for technical support was also very important for us early on. And so I very quickly kind of became the point person for maintaining tech support issues and keeping an issues log and a resolutions log and creating um, you know reporting those issues with MadCap as needed, or just kind of troubleshooting those within our own IT support as well. But if you have a strong IT support, I recommend getting familiar with them and leveraging them as much as you're able to. But also, MadCap technical support has been very helpful over the years as well, and we've had many times where we've called them up and they've been able to work us through different issues, and we've had quite a learning experience with our own knowledge of CSS and source control and all the other types of issues that may come up as a new Flare user. We also wanted to make sure that chemical formulas and mathematical equations were accessible with Flare. Again, we're writing a lot of science content, and with that comes a lot of chemical formulas, where if a certain value isn't subscript or superscript, you're no longer working with, H2O has a completely different meaning when you're not appropriately doing the subscript there. So there's a lot of different things that were very important in order to get mathematical equations in Flare for us. And we've been really pleased with how these have worked so far. There's a couple hiccups along the way, but I think in this latest version of Flare, or it may have been a version ago, where you can now import these equations into Flare, that's been a huge lift for us and been very helpful in giving us the ability to provide content to our customers. That's very important. And I also recommend that new users in Flare develop test plans for changes. And I'm not even meaning specifically when you upgrade from one version of Flare to another, which that's important. But also if you're going to test new Flare targets, or if you'll find that there's a few differences between how a Word target's going to display versus how a PDF target's going to display. Also, if you're updating your Windows environment or you're getting an upgrade to Word, I've experienced on a number of different occasions, I think there was a combination of changes that we'd experienced that MadCap technical support actually helped us sort through, where we simultaneously upgraded Word, Windows, and Flare, and for some reason, something in the code ended up touching our Adobe output files, and our superscript text wasn't displaying with the same level of superscriptness that it was supposed to be showing, I guess. And they were able to identify where a display setting on our Windows side had changed from the default. I don't remember the combination of things, but what we have found is that anytime we do any upgrades that may affect any of our Flare outputs, we just go through and we just rebuild at least one sample of each of our output types, and we have a checklist of items that we want to make sure haven't changed, so that the expectation and the quality of our product that we submit to our customers is stable and ready to go at any moment's notice. So we've talked about how to organize our assets. We've downloaded Flare on our system. We always go back to the customer. We wanted to make sure that we were still meeting the customer's needs. We didn't want to lose our customer focus along the way. And so we made sure that the outputs that were always available, our Word, our PDF, the multiple combinations of files that we wanted available were there. And we also wanted to make sure that we were taking advantage of new content deliveries for web-based and mobile outputs as well. So we didn't want to lose that along the way. But how did we prepare our content for import into Flare? Well, as I alluded to before, we used what's called the word import template in Flare to migrate all of our documents. And this wasn't necessarily a border crossing moment for us where one day all of our content was in Word and then poof, all of our content one day was in Flare. What we found was very helpful for us was identifying early candidates for Flare. And where we drew that line was new content for either our lab books or our user manuals for new products specifically. And then we decided to implement maybe our next 10 highest selling products for the user manuals, and then other lab books as they became due for revision. And what that looks like when you're using the word import template is what you want to do is first you want to stage your Word files with appropriate H1 styles, paragraph styles, bullet styles, etc. And then you have the opportunity to open up the Word import template in Flare and then map those Word styles to the styles that you want them to correspond to within Flare. So the corresponding H1 styles, paragraph styles, and you need to build those styles in your CSS when you get started. So there's a lot of legwork even before you begin importing your content. You need to get your page layout set up and your styles set up so that you can map those into the different mediums that you want to make available in your CSS, which for us, we initially started with a lab books medium and a user manuals based medium that we called booklets. And then we, one by one, began importing those files into Flare. And we saved those into the Content Explorer file structure. And we saved them based on what we defined as topics. So as I mentioned earlier, for user manuals, these were very small sets of information for each of the different sections in the booklets that we were providing. For the lab books, these were a little bit trickier for us because we wanted to maintain that ability of keeping all of our instructions in one larger file set. So each experiment itself became a topic. And so again, how do you seamlessly transition your content to Flare? I can say even to this day, we still have some legacy Word files that are out there, but slowly but surely, we are migrating our content over to Flare. I like to say this implementation has much more resembled the tortoise than the hare, but slowly but surely, we've been getting all of our content into Flare, and we're doing it at a pace that's very comfortable to us, and each step along this journey, we've been looking at different ways to speed up the import process. How do we get content in there quicker? I've got a few tips and tricks I've learned along the way where we've been able to reduce our import time for lab books from a 6-week period to about a 2-week period using some macros in Word, setting up different macros in Flare. I know there was some interest in the MadWorld community when I first delivered this presentation to maybe do some follow-up on some of those tips and tricks. So that may be a future presentation or a blog post, or if you want to drop me a line sometime if you'd like to see some of the tips and tricks that we're doing to get our content into Flare more quickly, I'd be happy to share that with you. So this is now what a completed lab book in Flare would look like for us. And those first 2 columns on the left are the table of contents for a lab book file. So you can see how we've set up our topics to be more experiment-based. And then the ISNT stands for instructor. So then we have our instructor, our teacher note files that provide the teachers with some additional support. And then you can see on the right-hand side all the different targets that can be produced for one lab book. So again, it's not like we're making just one textbook that's just this one big monolithic file set. We also have some dynamic electronic resources that provide different combinations of software use. And I don't think I mentioned this before, but we produce PDF and also Word files. And the reason why we like to produce the Word files is it gives the teacher ultimate flexibility in their classroom. We actually give them permission to modify the instructions to fit their classroom needs. So if they don't want to do an extra extension at the end of one of the experiments that we've provided, or if they have some additional safety concerns that they have for the classroom, or some additional steps that they'd like to follow, they can modify that as well. And we try to make the files as versatile as possible so that they can support whatever combination or whatever needs they have in the classroom. So again, we're always thinking about the customer when we're putting together our content. I mentioned a little bit about what our Flare implementations look like, and here's a map that kind of shows what our timeline has been. So again, we didn't necessarily have, it's not like we downloaded Flare and poof, all of our Word files, 20 years, 30 years worth of documents were in Flare. We had a very methodical approach where to this day, this slide's a little bit dated now, but to this day we have closer to 20 lab books in Flare and probably over 100 user manuals by now. And our content library in Flare is growing by the day. And it all just kind of is a testament to all of the upfront planning that we've done, and then just having that direction and knowing how you want to continue growing your library as different iterations of Flare come out and as different opportunities are available in getting your content into Flare. So I promised you in the beginning some key milestones and cost-saving decisions. I would say our first major milestone was when we made our first lab book in Flare. And this was kind of that proof of concept. Hey, this is why we got Flare to begin with. We wanted to make content in here. As I like to say, we wanted to make widgets, and now we're making widgets. Here we go. We've got one in here. It was a book called Investigating Wind Energy. It was a new book for us at the time, and it was very exciting for us to see that Flare was really going to mirror the types of lab books that we had already been creating prior to adopting it as our content management system. Streamlining our Word import process in Flare. I mentioned earlier that our first lab book, once we got our CSS and our page layouts and everything set up, I think that import and all of the formatting and stuff took us about 6 weeks. That's just because of all the different software combinations and conditions and targets that we use. But we noticed that there was a lot of manual intervention where not all of our styles had mapped appropriately. We were experiencing what I liked to call the double bullet phenomena, where a lot of our bullet points were mapping over as paragraph styles that included a bullet point, and then when you added the list item, you're getting what I like to call the double bullet point. Then you had to unbind your paragraph and then reapply the list, and it was a real tricky process, and a lot of our content is step-by-step instructions. So we found some workarounds with macros and different ways of setting up our content. I'd be happy to share with you on at another time or on an individual basis. But being able to cut down that import time and the manual intervention of formatting and Flare, and allowing us, once again, our primary focus is the words, the editorial reviews, and writing words from scratch. And so the less time we have to manage our files and format them, the more time and effort we can put toward quality words and quality content for our customers. Implementing online user manuals was a new concept for us. Previously, we shipped all of our user manuals, which were often 20, 30 pages long for some of them. And what we found was that when we made them available electronically, but made the PDFs available as a download that the user could print on their own at home, but instead also made web-based dynamic content with really fun drop downs and adjustable screen sizes based on your computer monitor or whether you're viewing it on a mobile device. That was a real lift for us, and this was a real cost-saving decision for us and real value as well, because the cost of shipping so many pages of paper, what we found was when we converted our first 10 user manuals, we were saving about $30,000 a year just in shipping costs, just by making our content available on the web versus sending hard copy forms to the customer. And so that was a real cost-saving decision for us. Transitioning source control systems, making sure that we all had access to the same content and not losing content along the way. There's always a fear when you've been doing one thing for so long that can kind of become the devil you know, as they say. And so when we went from one source control system to another, I think there was a little bit of anxiety. We did a lot of testing to make sure that if somebody checked the file in, the next user was able to also use it, and so forth. And transitioning our source control systems ultimately was a growing experience for us, a learning experience, and also showed us that we didn't need to have fear in losing our content. Not one time did we feel like we needed to revert back to an earlier version because we lost a file along the way. So that was a very, very important milestone for us. And using Contributor with our subject matter experts has also been something that we started I want to say less than a year ago or so. Maybe it's been longer. I can't quite remember now. But we have a couple of users that were curious about using basically the content that we get to see in Flare, and writing from a more topic-based environment and not providing these Word documents that we would then import into Flare. And so we have found that sharing files with these select users so far has been a very good experience. We've even had other users ask us when they're going to get to use Contributor. And that's always the big fear when you're implementing a new system. You just don't know if other users are going to want to even adopt it. And so having other users enthusiastic about waiting their turn to try it out has been very nice for us. And we're excited to continue exploring what MadCap Central is going to provide as their new cloud-based authoring contribution tool as well. And so as I leave you with a few takeaways here today, I just want to thank everyone for joining the webinar. And I would be very happy to hear about your journeys and experiences with Flare as well. Here's my contact information. Feel free to drop me a line anytime you'd like. And Rachel, I will hand the phone back over to you.
Thanks, Chad. That was great. So we have a couple of quick things before we get to the Q&A, and I'm seeing a lot of questions come in. If you want to flip to the next slide, we have the date set for MadWorld next year, which is April 14th to 17th at the Hard Rock Hotel. If you're interested in becoming a speaker for MadWorld, we're currently accepting submissions in our call for presentations. So if you have any Flare best practices or advanced techniques you'd like to share, we'd love to see your ideas. And so with that, let's take a look at the questions that came in. Just to start off the QA, Chad, can you give your definition of what is source control?
Well, what source control looks like for us is it's a way to archive and maintain your files in Flare. So one way of looking at it is as a versioning software. So if I make a change to a specific file and I save that file and then I use source control to archive that change, what it allows me to do is look at multiple versions of how that file has evolved over time. So you might make a change and then realize later on, oh boy, we made that change. You know, the warm-up time is 30 seconds for this. When was it 10 seconds though? When was it a smaller number? And you can go through your version history and go, oh, looks like 2 versions ago it was a different variable. what source control also does is it allows you to share your topics on your local machine with other users that you have on your team. And so I have a couple of team members as well that use Flare. We all make changes locally on our own machine. Jamie or Alex or Gretchen, who are also on my team, they can't see the changes I'm making until I push those changes up to the source control repository. And it's not until they pull those changes down onto their local machines that they can see those changes as well. And so a couple of source control options that are out there, I know a lot of people use TFS, Perforce, and there's been a growing emphasis in using Git as well.
Great. Another question, how long did your implementation take?
I would say from the first time that we downloaded Flare to the first time that we actually created an output was probably about 6 months, because we needed to set up all of our CSS, our page layouts, and we had a lot of concept conversations where we would create sample targets, and then we would literally pull out the magnifying glasses and the rulers, and we would compare outputs that came from Flare to outputs that were already existing in our content library, because we wanted those to look identical. But I'd say as a Flare user, you can expect it to be 2 or 3 months. But it's kind of funny because, and I meant to touch on this during the presentation, but it's not like the organization stops making new content while you're implementing the Flare software. So that was another obstacle for us to overcome was, where do we draw that line in the sand? And I think what you need to really do as a new Flare user is just start making content in there, and then you'll start seeing how you can take advantage of the content that's existing in order to leverage more new content. And we found that we had more similarities in our content than we realized. And so, but I would say just on a timeline basis, I would try to give it a good 3 to 6 months to really get the ball rolling on your project.
Great. We have one attendee that's wondering if you could just flip back to your takeaway slide, maybe just to display your contact
Oh,
information.
sure. Yeah, yeah.
Perfect. There you go. And as another question, let's see. Do you have a quick tip or something that you can share when importing bullet lists? We have another attendee that has the same problem that you've described and wanted to know if you
Sure,
had any
sure.
tips.
So what we have found, what we began doing, there's a couple of different ways that you can approach this, and it kind of depends on what you want that bullet list to look like in Flare. You can actually create a paragraph style that includes a bullet list. And so in your Word file, what you can do is you can run a macro that strips out all of the bullet styles in Word, but then have that map over to a special character, that then you map that character to a new paragraph style in Flare that includes a bullet point to it. Now, when you do that and then you do the import, your bullet points are going to show up. The character style is going to read over to the Flare style with the bullet list, but it's still going to show as a paragraph tag. So another option you can do is you can run that same macro, strip the bullets out, and then at least when you're applying your bullets manually in Flare, you're no longer having to go through that step where you unbind the bullet. There's a few different techniques. It just kind of depends on what you want your code semantically to look like as well.
Perfect. And then we have time just for one last question. Again, if anybody else has any questions, feel free to write them in the Q&A doc or in the Q&A panel. Do you continue to link the Word documents to the projects so that writers without Flare can continue to use Word?
No, we've explored doing that on a couple of different occasions, and we finally had made some notes in our decision log as to why that model wasn't going to work in our organization. And one of the main reasons for that is is when that document is changed, you get notified as a Flare user, and then you need to re-import that topic in order to get those changes back into Flare. And so trying to tie the loop in on that hasn't been as successful for us. If there's been any successes out there in using that, I'd be more than happy to entertain any new ideas for that. But we haven't been able to work that into our workflow just because of the maintenance and the additional formatting that we would have to do. So we tend to generate the outputs from Flare as Word, and then round tripping files has been very, very tricky for us. But using contributors has been much more helpful in closing that gap.
Perfect. We're just about at the top of the hour, so that's all the time that we have for questions. Chad, thank you so much for hosting this presentation. There's a lot of great information in here.
Great. Well, thank you, and I appreciate everyone who joined us today.
Yeah. Thanks to everyone for joining, and we'll be sending out this information after this webinar, and have a great day. Thanks.